Good morning and welcome to the Southwest Public Policy Institute's live stream panel on Oppenheimer with Charles Oppenheimer. I'm Megan De La Rosa, Chair of the Board of Directors for SPPI. Our mission at SPPI is to improve the quality of life in the American Southwest by formulating, promoting, and defending sound public policy solutions based on the principles of free enterprise, personal responsibility, limited government, individual freedom, and traditional American values. We are dedicated to delivering better living through better policy. SPPI is a 501c3 nonprofit charitable organization. Contributions to the Institute are tax deductible. Our work is sponsored by viewers like you. Please join me in welcoming our guest for today, Charles Oppenheimer. Charles has spent his career in software as an employee, entrepreneur, and investor. He believes there is value in representing J. Robert Oppenheimer by investing and advocating for nuclear energy. Welcome, Charles. We're thrilled to have you join us. And now, I will hand it over to Vice President, Research of Southwest Public Policy Institute, Dowd Muska.
Thank you very much, Megan, and thank you, Charles, for joining us today. Charles has a hard out, and we're not going to keep him anywhere even close to an hour, hopefully. But we've got a lot of information to discuss. Obviously, Charles is a member of a very famous family, notable in the world of nuclear physics. But we're not really going to be talking today too much about the Manhattan Project in the past. We're going to be talking about what Charles and a common ground that Charles and I have, and our organization has on the issue of nuclear technology, nuclear generation of electricity via nuclear technology, which has been a great gift to mankind, brought about by some of the brilliant men profiled in, let's see, we'll go with Richard Rhodes's Making of the Atomic Bomb, but lots of other books, and of course the book chronicling J. Robert Oppenheimer's was American Prometheus, I think, the book that Christopher Nolan used as the basis, and of course went off in his own directions. And we're not going to get into the historicity of the film, ladies and gentlemen. It's certainly fascinating films. I actually saw it yesterday. But Charles comes from, he's the grandson of J. Robert Oppenheimer. He comes from a software background, lives in the Bay Area. He's been involved heavily in software in his career and done a lot of entrepreneurship, investing, that sort of thing. Charles is a fan of nuclear power, as am I, as are everyone associated with the Southwest Public Policy Institute. Charles, you had a recent piece just a couple months ago in Time Magazine, very public platform for you, leveraging your experience and your family's name, putting it behind nuclear power. What are your core beliefs about nuclear power and why we need it to produce more electricity in America and throughout the world?
Yeah. Well, in addition to being in Oppenheimer, I'm from New Mexico too. So I don't know if anybody, if you're in New Mexico now, Dowd, or anybody else.
I'm in Albuquerque right now. Yes.
There we go. So yeah, I grew up in New Mexico, and so I always stay pretty in touch with it. And I would say a family value, growing up in the Oppenheimer family, there was definitely an idea that we shouldn't have a lot of weapons pointing at each other, but it wasn't strictly like pro-nuclear energy. Like a lot of people, I grew up with like a vaguely negative idea of nuclear energy, thinking it was unsafe. Yeah, just kind of the affiliation with nuclear weapons made it seem unattractive, a problem. And it was only in the last few years that I said, like a lot of people, you look at the circumstance of the world and understand we need way more energy. I think that was one part of my change in attitude, that we could achieve what we need to do as in human society, either through conserving a tremendous amount of energy, which was like the traditional environmental outlook, or producing a huge amount. And after some analysis, I thought like it's really not practical or even ethical in developing countries, which I do a lot of investing in, to tell developing economies that you can't consume as much energy as the first world, and your duty is to stay in kind of subsistence living while developed economies. So kind of pursuing the idea of energy abundance, I looked into it and said, what would be the best way to generate a lot more energy, and looking into nuclear energy, not because I'm in Oppenheimer, but just because I thought it was interesting. What I found surprised me, which is that, first of all, the feeling and the ideas around it are changing rapidly. I found that even over the last 5 years, there's been this really massive convergence of of popularity, spanning, the real mover was the kind of Democrat or left side's acceptance of it, where conservative kind of energy focused investors or people were already up to about 60%. But I've found that the support for nuclear energy in the US is approaching 60% and passing that. And that's kind of a landslide in American politics. It's one of those few areas of bipartisanship. And I found with just light levels of research that almost all my conceptions about nuclear energy were wrong, in that it was dangerous and can you solve the danger problems. I very soon found that it's not dangerous as measured by the performance of the industry. Like the number of people who died, the number of people who've gotten sick, that's real danger. There's fear danger, which is very high. It seems scary, it is scary. But when you look at the actual performance of the industry, that it has not been a dangerous thing. And then I thought, well, the waste problem is a terrible problem. You have to solve it. And I looked into that and understood that it was effectively, if you did nothing other than we already do with nuclear waste, which is store it on site on generating capacities, that's not a problem. And so it just, there's kind of a renaissance of nuclear energy enthusiasm across, in particular, advocates who talk and advocate for it a lot. And then also just generally politically, I think things are converging to make it a palatable position from any kind of political or economic background.
Yeah, I think we spoke before we started streaming. I mean, the polling data, it's almost like as the baby boomers sort of retire and begin to die off, we in Generation X are sort of somewhere in the middle, but millennials and Generation Z seem to be much more, and they're also concerned about climate change, which we don't need to get into, but there seems to be much more openness. Maybe they weren't propagandized as much as some of our older generations, whether it was the China syndrome or those types of movies and nonsense. But I want to read a quote from the Sierra Club, and I just picked this up, I think it was yesterday, so I don't think they've renounced this statement at all. They call nuclear power, quote, a uniquely dangerous energy technology for humanity, close quote. We haven't vanquished that type of thinking yet. We're still struggling, even though the signs are good, and I think the future is very positive. The statement, a uniquely dangerous energy technology for humanity, made by what many people would consider the leading environmental organization in America or on planet Earth. Your reaction, uniquely dangerous energy technology?
Well, there is scary industrialized components of nuclear energy. So dismissing people's fears, I'm sometimes inclined to do that, saying, oh, it's not dangerous. But the best advocates I know in the space are just really welcoming to people who've changed their perspective, and are apolitical. If you're only coming into it from a kind of like right-wing attitude, then that only gets you so far. I think there's just a ton of room in the middle. And I don't think Sierra Club is right. If you look at the facts, right, the facts of the number of deaths and the damage that nuclear energy has caused compared to trailings from coal mines and compared to pollution from gas powered and other industrialized systems, even disasters on oil mining rigs, all of those kill and hurt many more people. The interesting thing about nuclear technology is it is complicated. It is potentially dangerous to people, but that results in a system of engineering that really contains the risk. That's what we see over and over. Flying is dangerous. There's nothing more dangerous that you could do is go up in a tin can and fly at hundreds of miles an hour, 1,000. But for that reason, we have incredible engineering processes. And, when you don't have that rigorous engineering, all kinds of disasters can happen. So I think that's what there is some truth to nuclear energy, or any energy source can be dangerous. But if you contain those risks, especially with scientific engineering and large scale processes, you can contain them. And that's been proven with the history of the industry. Most people today, if you talk to them, they'll say, oh, well, what about Fukushima? What about 3 Mile Island? And those sound like terrible things. But then when you ask how many people were killed by the nuclear technology and they find out it's zero, I don't think it necessarily makes them into advocates. But that Oliver Stone movie, Nuclear Now, which I encourage everybody to watch,
Yeah, I was going to ask
I
you
think
about
does
that.
a really good history of how the political side, how it got skewed as a political issue through media portrayal that was not really ground in substantive facts about the potential energy source.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned flying because I am a nervous flyer who doesn't enjoy it, but when I have to, I get on the plane anyway. And I think there's probably a lot of folks like me out there. And when you use the word complicated, I also think it's why people still fear nuclear technology to some extent. I think it has a lot to do with our day-to-day perception of risk. And when you get in your car and drive to work, you never think you're going to be a car accident, even though 40,000 people die a year in America on the highways. Never occurs to us. I don't know how many times, how many days or weeks I go without thinking about being in a car accident when I drive every day. Um, the nature of, and I would actually liken this to diseases, germs that are microscopic, and you can't smell them, and you can't see them. The fact that brilliant scientists starting a century ago or more started to unpack atoms and the subatomic structure, it's very hard and intimidating, especially in a country like America where math and chemistry and physics are we sort of terrorize children with, though this is the really hard stuff, and oh, I can't do that. Is there something inherent about the science here that people just don't grasp, that scares them and injects this irrational fear that the anti-nuclear activists sort of prey upon?
Yeah. There is parts of it. It's actually the interesting, like tracing back the history of advocates against nuclear energy were funded by fossil fuel companies. And some of the original fears around radiation was also funded. I think, I can't remember the foundation, so I don't want to say it, but it's one of the big ones, big two ones out of New York that was directly tied to fossil fuel. So even the initial that's in addition to nuclear energy being introduced into the world as a weapon of terror. That's really what nuclear weapons are. So that's really, it's part of the history of it, and it's part of the affiliation. But even after that, in the 1950s, there was a huge buildup of sharing information around nuclear energy, even in countries that were going into misguided arms race. And arms race was a terrible thing to get into, and that really affected all the future of nuclear energy. And so this word starts getting out of how dangerous, radiation is, and there was some intentional marketing of how terrible it was, including, some of the first environmental. Nuclear now makes the point that nuclear energy was seen as an environmental option initially because at scale it would reduce a lot of what they just viewed as smog pollution from cars and exhaust, which was already getting bad. And if you could do cleaner at scale energy, it could support a lot more people. And it got recast from the early days as an extremely dangerous, scary thing. And that is an element of it, derived from weapons. It's science-based. You need to understand it. But I have faith in that type of engineering. Like, humans can do amazing things through engineering and safety processes that you can't do if you're not involved in that level of expertise, right? And the flight systems, and even any industrial plant that exists out there, you can contain risks through good engineering process. And the more danger it is, the more likely you are to actually do that, instead of just taking a risk.
Sure.
Um,
Is part of this problem? I mean, you get on the plane, you've been on the plane, the pilot has that wonderful Midwestern accent when he comes on the comms and says, folks, we're going to take you across the Continental Divide. And you just have that confidence. Nuclear power plants, we only have, I think we're under 100 reactors now in the United States. They are these sort of mysterious, off in the distance kind of facilities. And whether it's just experiencing the actual physical infrastructure or understanding the science. I mean, what do we need to do to educate people? I will grant them that these are technical matters, and you do have to think a little to understand this. But how do we just break that mystery and that scariness down for people, because it still persists?
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely persists, but the question is, how far do you need to go? The nuclear advocates that I've run into, including Stand Up for Nuclear, which helped save the Diablo Canyon plant, Isabel Isodope, if you know her on Twitter. There's a whole new genre of people who talk about this and produce content constantly. I ran into them first at Titans of Nuclear. I don't know if you know that podcast, which is super compelling. And the more of this media that really is not directly politically motivated, but people are usually just so wonky about, like, I don't understand why we're not doing what we should do in society, producing more energy. I think is a really good, safe source of things. Now, the question is, how far do you need to go in that? Like, if this was just a couple years ago, you'd say, wow, nuclear energy is such a good idea, but we can never do it. That was everybody's perception. I think that there's already bipartisan enough political support to do nuclear. What's missing a lot. So then the question is, like, do you double down on trying to get the other 40% of people who don't like it? Or you just say, well, we elect a president with 50%.
Right.
We can do some expansion of power. And is the political blockers the main thing now? Or is it the regulatory environment? Or is it the financial and, like, kind of practical side of doing projects that actually are really the thing that you need to focus on? Because no matter what you say about nuclear energy, it's not simple, and it's massive projects, and it takes major investment, major commitment, major financial backing and planning. And you could get this huge swell of support for it, which frankly, it has moved over the last 5 years enough, but that's not enough to actually affect things. And when I say affect things, the DOE says we need at least 200 more gigawatts of nuclear energy, which is twice our entire infrastructure right now, to meet some of our carbon and climate goals, or just even energy goals. We need way, way, way more energy. And so it only matters when it's, beyond this kind of political pundit thing, and it's actually producing carbon-free energy at major scale and taking fossil fuel energy out of the air. There's a lot of steps to get there. And I'm not sure that focusing on the political part is where I feel called to focus on right now, basically.
Sure. It's an interesting issue because it's one of those rare issues that really cuts across right, left, Democrat, Republican. Before we go to the future, Charles, I just looked up last night International Atomic Energy Agency numbers from 2022, 770 terawatt hours the United States nuclear industry produced in last year. Number two, people might think China, France, but it's actually China, 395 terawatt hours in China. The United States, despite, and I'm sure a lot of people, maybe folks on the environmental left, who've been told by the Sierra Club that this is a dying technology and we're happily putting this behind us, this dark era of nuclear technology. We are the #1 producer of nuclear electricity on planet Earth, and we're almost double the number two. We have the most reactors, and by far we produce the most. China, where a lot of our friends on the left, the sort of Tom Friedman types who would like to have that, I would call, fascistic structure where the government just decides to do something, we're going to do all nukes. They're only at 5%. We're still producing 20%. And as you said earlier, I don't know if it was on when we were broadcasting or not, what the industry has done post 3 Mile Island, the ability to uprate, the ability to boost their capacity factors, the equivalent of adding dozens of more reactors without turning a shovel at all. Right now, the industry has a tremendous amount to boast about right now, even before we explore what the future might be. So I just wanted to get those numbers in for folks who might be down on the industry or happy about the industry failing. The industry is not failing. The industry, to this day, even before we talk about the future, is doing some pretty amazing things. And of course, we're not at France's 63%, where we're about 19-20%, but we are doing amazing things. The future, the debate, and I watched a really fascinating podcast a couple days ago about a young physicist who was not happy about the small modular reactor, the promotion of that, because he said we know how to do the big reactors. Let's not
That
throw
must be James Krellenstein.
That was James Krellenstein.
I know James well.
I'm sure that doesn't surprise me. So we do hear a lot about small modular reactors, and that might be the savior of the industry. James has his views on that. Your thoughts on the technology moving forward? There is, and of course, we have big players like people like Bill Gates looking at different types of technology. There's the pebble bed reactor, and people books have been written about thorium. Should we be exploring? Should we have an all of the above approach to nuclear, or should we more narrow cast it and focus more on one or two technologies?
So I guess that's a two-part question.
Yes,
There
sorry, I
is
apologize.
there is room for an all of the above approach. And so what has been more compelling for investors over the last 10 years is the advanced nuclear. And a lot of that comes out of the, venture capital community and the idea that like the nuclear industry is broken, it's not working, and we can invent something new and it'll be better. There's been a lot of investment there. There is some advantages for advanced nuclear in every way, because if you can tell people, hey, we have a safer way to contain the waste. That's a compelling argument. You can say, well, you didn't like it before, but now we've actually solved it. You're not wrong. You're not crazy because you're in the Sierra Club, but you had a point. Now we have a new way to do it. That's just an easier conversation than saying everybody's wrong about it. So that is true, that there's room for investment. Now, James, one thing I really like about his perspective is he's an engineer, and to him, it's a lot different to say that you've invented a new reactor and that you've been working on it for 10 years, but you don't have it in production. That is completely different than saying that you have a completely designed system that's been done once, twice, 5 times, 15 times. And as we all know, with construction, engineering, and science projects, that's just a completely different proposition. That's one part of the argument for big nuclear that I like a lot. The other part that I like is the scale of it. Like these are big problems, our energy and carbon problems, and we really need to apply really big solutions to it. And so I find myself a little more geared towards how can we do more utility scale nuclear. And even though it's been unpopular and financially disastrous and everything else for the last 40 years to expand a lot of energy, that doesn't mean that we can't start right now and get going with, the scale that we need to do at utility scale. But I don't, both of those can be simultaneously true, as Bohr would say, with the complementary principle. And that one's a simple one. Yes, we need all of the above for advanced nuclear, and we need to expand our things that we've already learned out of large scale 1950s technology. It's not bad because it came from the 1950s.
Exactly.
It boils water at a large scale, produces a huge amount of carbon-free energy. We should absolutely be doing that as fast as possible.
Yeah,
and also there's just obvious applications, like in developing worlds and islands and all kinds of places you actually want smaller throughput, and you'd be better off using the modular system. In any venture technology investment, you're always pouring this kind of absurd amount of money into something up front, which actually a fair amount of science is like that. And you get a payoff if it really scales, and then that has never happened in the SMR industry. It's the theory, but it hasn't actually happened where we're passing it through factories. I'm not saying that it's not going to happen, but I would say right now there's a real call for doubling down on large nuclear, while these bets that have already been in play on SMR and advanced reactors are playing out.
Sure. You briefly mentioned waste, and I refuse to call it waste as it relates to spent nuclear fuel, because we don't really know that.
That's a better term.
It may be, and I don't think it's wishful thinking to say in the future it may be useful material. The waste, it seems to me, the anti-nuclear forces, and I think I checked it out last night. There was a new analysis done. I think it was by the Capital Research. The opponents of nuclear, they did a dive onto the budgets of some of these entities, and Sierra Club was included in that. I think they came up with the annual revenue of opponents of carbon-free nuclear power exceeds $2.3 billion. There are still enormously wealthy institutions out there fighting nuclear, and I think as the Chernobyls have not happened in the United States, every day that passes and people don't die from ridiculous mushroom clouds that are physically impossible to happen at reactors. If you just do a little reading, you can find that out, folks. It's just not enough material. It's not the right type of material. It just simply can't happen. Every day that passes, those scenarios don't play out in reality. It seems like the last ditch for the really rabidly anti-nuclear people is the waste issue. Of course, they will use the term waste. And We have two very interesting proposals in Texas and New Mexico here about consolidated interim storage of spent nuclear fuel. How effective is that argument in your experience? I mean, does it still resonate with enough people? We haven't solved the waste issue, so we can't possibly. I think the California law, and it might be some other states where, until we have a permanent repository, there can be no expansion of nuclear in our state. It does seem to be one of their favorite tactics. And if you really look at it closely, it's very hollow and very silly, frankly. But is that an obstacle we pro-nuke folks have yet to really surmount?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the most common things that come up, no matter what, unless they're like a nuclear energy advocate. It always comes up. Well, we've got to solve the problem of waste and the danger in it. There's a lot of techniques to discuss it, depending on how much time you have looking at nuclear waste. When you understand it's surrounded in casks and actually isn't dangerous, understanding the background where it can't be a nuclear bomb, understanding the facts of, with the worst problem scenarios that have ever happened with nuclear plants that didn't kill or injure almost anybody. And in the worst scenario, like Chernobyl, it was, disastrously mismanaged with old technology and, didn't kill as many people as a chemical plant in Texas. So,
sure.
But, the best advocates that I've seen stand up for nuclear in Texas, they never meet this on with just spitting 5 facts in the face of the person. I'm willing to do that and be like, well, you're wrong about this, this, and that. I don't know if it works. I think there's also room to say, well, there's a new way to work with spent nuclear fuel. We can recycle it. That's really safe. And advanced nuclear in general, either big reactor or SMRs, have constantly improving safety standards. So kind of like, instead of saying you're wrong, you have to change your attitude, there's room to say, oh yeah, the way nuclear waste used to be could have caused a problem, but the new way we're dealing with it isn't a problem. And that idea of recycling it and having new storage systems should be attractive enough to people without even changing their mind. But also, yeah. So I think those two things, that's an attractive approach of the changes in dealing with it. I've been struck by, one of the many factoids I would throw out there is that, while people say that it's, a huge problem, you could say, well, the total amount of waste ever generated from all nuclear energy fits in a football stadium. So is that a massive problem or not? And some people might say that is a massive problem. I can't believe we have that problem. And for me, that's just not a logical conclusion when you look at the scope of our energy production across all sources, including solar panels and batteries and everything else. You can't say something that only fills up one football stadium over 80 years is too much if we're going to do all the other things. I don't know if that convinces people, but I found it kind of convincing as the scope. And the other thing is, if we don't do anything other with nuclear fuel, we don't recycle it, we don't get a centralized facility, and you keep it on site, to me, that seems so much different than all the other energy sources. Because when you do a natural gas plant or a coal plant, you're spewing the output into the air, and you're creating tailings, and you're bringing it away. When you create solar panels, you're doing a massive amount of mining and creating panels and putting them out there. So the whole cycle isn't contained, and nuclear is the only one. If you do nothing other than leave it on the site, that the entire life cycle forever is there. And then some people would say, well, that's going to last 1,000 years. And to me, I'm like, yes. And so is a skyscraper. So is that road. We do anthropology from 12,000 years ago in New Mexico and find bones and shards of things. And everything we do on the planet is going to be here 10,000 years from now, including a nuclear plant that is not a danger. So I don't know. I think it's kind of preaching to the choir. We could go on in the nuclear advocacy and safety space. And maybe that is important. I really believe in crossing over to the other side. No matter what you're saying about this, it shouldn't be a political thing. There's more bipartisan convening on this for whatever perspective. We need more energy. We need less carbon. We need less waste, in my opinion, less danger. There's all kinds of reasons to be behind nuclear energy, no matter what your perspective is.
Well, of course, as a partial New Mexican, you're aware that right down the road from you here in
Oh, I'm not
Sandia,
partial. I am
not
full New
you're full.
Mexican. I'm
Okay, all right,
just
Mr.
not happen to
California.
be in New Mexico right now.
Well,
Sometimes people ask me, where are you from? And I'm like, well, New Mexico, but I haven't lived there for 25 years. So.
I was raised on an orchard in Connecticut, so I unfortunately, you can take the boy out of New England, but you probably can't take the New England out of the boy. You're well aware that right down the road from me at Sandia National Laboratories, they've done a lot of that testing on the cask and canister system, steel and concrete, thousands of shipments over the years of spent nuclear fuel. No injury or death related to any release of radiation. I'm not here to bash the coal industry, because there's a lot of things I like about the coal industry, but I think it was Richard Rhodes, of all people, who said, the coal industry stores its waste in your lungs, because a lot of that, a lot of those emissions go out into the atmosphere and you breathe it in. So to assail the nuclear industry as irresponsible and deadly, you should be expanding your horizons quite a lot. And I think that was one of the most effective arguments I've ever heard. We need to get Charles out of here quick, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm gonna start to wrap things up here. This is SPPI-TV. We are pleased to be talking to the grandson of J. Robert Oppenheimer, a name in the news quite a lot. Saw the movie yesterday. Charles Oppenheimer, who is a fan, an unapologetic promoter of nuclear energy. He comes at it from the sort of climate change perspective. I come at it from maybe a different perspective, but we're certainly on common ground on the power and the ability of baseload, pollution-free, efficient, impressive terrestrial. I think it was William Tucker, the book Terrestrial Energy. We're not using energy, or we're using energy from the earth, from the rocks themselves, not fossil fuels, not solar, not wind. And it's our pleasure to have Charles here today. Charles knows a little bit about financing. He does a little entrepreneurship, investing, that kind of thing. And I guess as we start to wrap things up, Charles, I want to ask about the domestically and internationally, the money that needs to be raised to expand our nuclear energy footprint on planet Earth. The old rap on nuclear, and I think we've seen it kind of again with the Vogtle in South Carolina or Georgia, and then the Summer plant, which was a complete disaster, and actually people went to jail in South Carolina about that. It's a pretty nasty experience. Was you have these immense capital costs. You've got to spend literally billions of dollars, but it pays itself off because these things are so efficient and they last for so long. You get that license period for 40 years. You can renew it for 20 years. And you need that upfront money. And one of the reasons that the industry suffered as much as it did in the 70s and 80s, early 80s, was because interest rates were completely out of control, and the ability to borrow money for these huge initial upfront costs became such a tremendous impediment. And there were lots of other reasons why the industry suffered what it did. In Forbes, 1985 called it, I think, the greatest. I think I have it in the Rhodes book. In 1985, Forbes called it the failure of the new U.S. nuclear power program ranks as the largest managerial disaster in business history. I mean, that's how ugly things got. The money. We need to find the right money in the right way, coming from the right sources at the right interest rates, to get these to build these new facilities that we believe would really help humanity in a lot of ways. The financial situation. I mentioned some of the tech bros and even Bill Gates. Really big names interested in this. Give us a picture of the lay of the land. Those of us who are outside of the finance world. Obviously, there's interest. Let's do a SWOT statement: strength, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, on getting the money we need, that we unquestionably need to move forward on nuclear.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess the strength has been funding for new and advanced technology, right? So there's a lot in the Department of Energy and Science and government-backed kind of science there. And then there's been much more capital for early stage startups who say that they're creating the next SMR, the next advanced reactor, the next widget, because venture capital is geared to fund those type of forward-looking technologies that, if they pay off, are going to be transformative. Now, unfortunately, venture capital is a very small part of the financial system. And what has been a lot less available is project financing for energy projects, in many types, but nuclear is probably the least popular of all the types. And that did precede the, as you mentioned, the interest rate situation in the 80s. Actually, most of the limits the regulatory burden with nuclear, because of the complication and also the kind of organizational structure, made it difficult and more expensive for everybody. But it didn't stop the projects. What really stopped large nuclear projects is project financing that was not an existential risk to the utility.
Right.
So I think that is really the next leg. How can we do project financing for projects? And in some parts of the SMR community is coming from that perspective. It's like, these projects are too big, they take too long, they overrun, let's do smaller versions of it. And I think there's some hope for that. But I also think that there's hope for pulling together finance projects, because there are people in the world who need to move $10 billion at a time. It's not good enough to do, a $3 million seed investment or a $50 million VC investment for 10 years. You need bond rate returns at large scale. And I'm seeing that there's an opportunity to kind of, with financial shielding, so that a utility doesn't have to risk its utility in funding a large nuclear plant, bringing people in from the financial community and the developer community, that allows the utility to pick up the output of produced energy. So that there's movement there, but the lesson from Vogtle is that, it took $30 billion and way too long. So I think you really need the next large nuclear project to prove the point that we could do it for 18 billion, and we could do it in 7 years or 10 years, and that really can set you off on the path. How do you get there? There's a certain amount of private industry backing, but the government, which was really important in my family history with the Manhattan Project, has a huge role and a huge ability to influence. I've gotten to know more and more people in the DOE and more programs. There is programs that can support that kind of structure, where the utility is not betting everything. You have some financial players in between who are help facilitating. You have the developers, and you have some guarantees on the government side. And to really get to the scale that we need, you need all those players. You don't need just one, tech startup guy. And so I think I'm doing kind of full-time research into that. Can we set up more, meeting and learning about project financing in this space? The numbers are huge, and I like that, frankly. But the risk is that you don't get anything going. You don't get the next Vogtle plant. So that was kind of a long answer, but that's what I'm most interested in, is the project financing side of the market, and tying in kind of government support and lab support where it's already available. The thing that I'm just newest on my list that I'm starting to look into is carbon credits for nuclear, and whether that could have a place to kind of level the playing field, because it's still much cheaper right now due to the current cost of natural gas to fire up a big natural gas plant. And if you believe in reducing carbon at all, there's a place for long-term incentives where could level the field now, but in 30 years from now, you're still not producing carbon. There should be some incentive for that. And that's so early and not supported by anybody that it's just a term right now, but I'm interested in looking into it.
Well, I will be rude to our guests, ladies and gentlemen, and simply inject the concept, as I feel I must, because it's one of the subjects I've studied the most in my policy career, is Yucca Mountain. What government giveth, government can take away. The U.S. Department of Energy's bungling of the Yucca Mountain project, and the inherently political nature of that, and frankly illegal stuff that was done, engineered by Harry Reid out of Nevada, has been, I think, a tremendous impediment, a burden on the industry. What I think probably could have been a successful project and safe storage of that. Yes, the government offers opportunities for pro-nuclear people, but let's never forget that the government can be a tremendous liability on as well.
This is where I get to wear my rose-colored glasses. I have a beginner's mind. I've never run into a thing. I don't really believe in politics. I'll sit down with a Republican, a Democrat, and find some common ground, and that's basically the best that I can bring to it. Just earlier this week, I met somebody from completely across the aisle in an abundance retreat who said, the problem is the Democrats, and if we get rid of them, we'll solve everything. And I said, let's sit down and talk about it. And he ended up inviting me out to Congress to talk about it. He was a representative. So I just think anybody can achieve common ground on these difficult things. And it's true that there's been government missteps in many areas in the past. Does that mean that's going to be our policy going forward, and that we only can use the free market to solve our energy problems? I just think that at a scale of the amount of energy we need to produce in the future to solve all of our problems, no matter what we believe they are, we need to bring everything to the table. So,
well, and you're very right to admonish me. I did mention a Democratic politician. In Nevada, there was universal Republican Democrat lockstep opposition to Yucca. They did everything they could. It didn't matter if the governor was a Democrat or Republican. The congressional delegation there, Republicans and Democrats, fought Yucca tooth and nail. And Charles, I appreciate, frankly, you correcting me, because I did mention a Democrat. I could say Republican Governor Kenny Gwynn. He fought it just as hard as Harry Reid. That NIMBYism in the state of Nevada. I love my Nevada. I lived there for a number of years, but that state did not acquit itself well.
And frankly, I don't know that much about the actually dealing with the government, but I'm getting to know more and more people in the DOE because it's easy for me to make friends there right now, and so I take advantage of that. It's a common Silicon Valley entrepreneur attitude to say, "Oh, government, I hate that. It moves so slow. We don't want anything to do with it." And I'm like, at this point, I'm not adopting that as my attitude. I'm like, what can we do with the government? What can we do with private industry? What can we do maybe even with the military someday, and testing those out? We had a colloquium here as part of the Oppenheimer project in July, where I invited about 100 lab scientists from the DOE, including the leaders. And I invited some people from my network of, 30, 40 venture capitalists and startup people. We all got in a room and talked about what we can do. And like, that can be a pretty electric combination compared to silos of groups who are only talking to each other and not crossing over, not mixing up. So that's the type of conversation.
One of the reasons I live in New Mexico is because there's these fascinating opportunities with the national labs to attend lectures and go to these things. And a number of years ago, some boys up at Los Alamos, a place your family knows a little bit about, they had developed, I think it's called the kilopower system. It was a small sort of nuclear electric generator for off-planet applications, and they're working with NASA and the DoD, and I think that's an example where something useful really could come out. I'd kind of like to see Elon take that over and run with it, because I don't want it to stay in government's hands. But I will concede. There are occasionally those types of opportunities. Internationally, Charles, and I know we're running super low on time. Back to the financing. Internationally, not just in California is the cool venture capital of the world, and you boys do all your neat projects. Sometimes though they don't work out. I'm sure there's some failures.
You only need 1 out of 1,000.
But what about East Asia? What about Europe? Is there money out there, pro-nuclear, in interested investors out there beyond the United States?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's a whole world of interest in Richard Rhodes. Since we've used his name several times in vain, we'll do it again. When I was talking to him about this subject, he said, you've got to work with the developing economies, Africa and India, because it's a triple return. They need unlimited economic growth. That path to economic growth is always through, advancement of energy systems, and the output is either coal soot or clean carbon. So you get all three of them. So, and I've also done a fair amount of investing in developing countries, mainly with, simple little software startups. So I think, to me, that's one of the most interesting parts, is going into developing countries, leapfrogging systems. That's happened plenty of times in Africa with mobile phones, and money systems are both more advanced in ways in developing economies. So there's real interest in that. You mentioned the more developed economies of Europe and East Asia. Those are some of the most capable construction places in the world, like South Korea. South Korea's nuclear industry. It kind of proves the point. You just improve your construction management technique of your concrete procurement, and you can make massive amount of nuclear. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to do SMRs. You just have to increase your rebar procurement and your concrete mix to get like a great
and ROK up to 30% of their power now, 10 percentage points more than the United States from nuclear.
That's right. So yeah, I mean, internationally, I'm as interested in it as anything. China, you mentioned their current stats, but they have a huge amount of planned nuclear coming on, and they will build it. Unlike us, we might sit around talking about it and not quite get there. They definitely will build it. There's been a real kind of, like, if you look at why SMR and nuclear stuff hasn't worked so far in the developing countries. It's almost purely financial and currency rate risk. So I think there's room there, especially with the more, the countries that already have goals of like improving developing economies. Norway's one of the top ones, and sovereign wealth funds that have an interest in developing economies to maybe smooth over some of those economic risks the same way you could do with utilities here. That's really hopeful. But then that brings us back to the most tricky and the hard stuff. This is all the easy stuff, nuclear energy for everybody. I'd like to say everybody agrees on it. But then you get to the really hard thing. Are we going to stop pointing weapons at each other? And that was our true family value. I still have the hope that doing this internationally and with other countries and with the scientific and economic ties that it brings in, it's actually a peace builder, because you have more of those systems controlling fissionable material, more peaceful applications of generating energy. That's the opposite of building bombs and having discord that could cause us all to die from weapons. So that's one of my fondest hopes with the international scene. And being in Oppenheimer, if I can say, hey, come to an Oppenheimer conference about energy, people will show up who wouldn't go to a Biden or a Trump conference, frankly. So I want to use that if possible.
That's wonderful. And I think one of the, as a free trader and a globalist in terms of maybe not global government, but just global free trade as a libertarian, the nuclear power story is incredibly encouraging, because from digging, uranium in the earth to R&D to engineering and construction and operation. I mean, there's so many it's an international market. And in fact, the whole Russian situation of late has really shown just how international the nuclear industry really is. And I think it's something that does bind countries together and makes the cost of conflict higher to the extent that we trade more and we share science, technology, and R&D.
It's always been, even in the midst of expansion of arms race, the countries were sharing nuclear reactor technology, even in the 50s, in the midst of conflict. And to this day, we're in conflict with Russia. We buy uranium from them. So it's increasing those scientific ties and industrial ties is better for everybody around energy. And it is more likely we could talk about the really hard things after that. Like,
we'll always go back to Richard Rhodes, of course. One of the things when I first read the book was how fascinating it was that the scientists who came over from the UK and the scientists who came down from Canada, I had this sort of American, leaving aside the scientists who fled Eastern Europe, because obviously it was tremendously hostile for a lot of the Jewish scientists who saw the writing on the wall, knew what was coming. It was born in international collaboration. So I think it's something that maybe isn't is people aren't as aware as they should be. Charles has a hard out. We have to get rid of Charles. He's on to other things, ladies and gentlemen. This has been SPPI-TV episode 21. Charles Oppenheimer, as he said, of the famous the New Mexico Oppenheimers. Let's call them. Charles, your work on this issue and other issues. How do people get in touch with you, find out more about it? You've got a family foundation, and you've got your fingers in a lot of pies.
Right. Just going to the oppenheimerproject.org would be the best way. There's email address. There's ways to. It's a nonprofit. You could donate, support the Oppenheimer Project, and when the investment arms kick off, I'm reach out if you have something to talk about.
Absolutely. That's how you get in touch with Charles. And I'm going to, live on camera, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to get Charles's pledge to come back and talk to us about artificial intelligence sometime in the future, because I know that's a subject of concern to him. And of course, people are speculating about how destructive potentially AI, almost on a nuclear weapon type apocalypticism. And I'd really love to get a deep dive on Charles's thoughts about that coming out of the software. So Charles, can we get an amen from you to come back and talk to us on that?
If we solve all our energy and world peace problems, I'm happy to. I'm just right on my count. No, just kidding. It could well work out. But I actually did have to make a decision, because the conflation or the extrapolation of, like, what did we learn from the Manhattan or the arms race and Oppenheimer? It's just so directly applicable to AI. So I discuss and write a little bit about it, but I felt like ultimately after, you need to narrow in on something. And I'm no Robert Oppenheimer, as I always say, but my grandfather said what we should do with fission and how we should get along. And I'm using that as a core value when I talk to people. And so a little more focus on fission, but always, often game to have a discussion about AI. So we'll
Excellent,
see.
excellent.
Yeah.
All right, Charles, we're going to see you back in New Mexico. You got to leave San Francisco once in a while, hopefully.
That's right. I've
And
visited a few times here.
all right, so we'll do lunch when you're back in the Albuquerque region.
Great
Thanks for
talking to
joining
you.
us. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Bye.
Thanks, folks.